Good evening. Welcome once again to the next in the series of Spine Wellness and Care Foundation webinars. Today, we have our webinar on Belt Your Life, Buckle Your Seatbelt Every Time. I just want to inform that those who have any questions may write them down in the chat box, and we will address the questions at the end of the webinar, at the end of the panel discussion. We'll have a discussion for 75 minutes and then have 15 minutes for any questions that any of the participants may have. "54 road accidents occur every hour and 1 death takes place every 4 minutes in India due to road traffic crashes." These are official statistics. In 2019, road traffic accidents resulted in 4,42,996 injuries and 1,81,113 deaths. Again, official statistics. Approximately 30 children under the age of 18 died every day due to road traffic accidents in our country in the year 2019. According to the WHO, 75% of the deaths resulted from road traffic accidents occurring in developing countries, although they own only 32% of the motor vehicles in the world. A seatbelt is a vehicle safety device that protects the driver or a passenger from potentially dangerous movement caused by an accident or sudden abrupt halt. A seatbelt reduces the risk of death or serious injury in a traffic collision by reducing the force of secondary impacts with interior strike hazards, keeping occupants properly positioned for maximum airbag effectiveness, preventing occupants from being ejected from the vehicle in a crash or if it rolls over. In a survey done in 2017, the victim was found not wearing a seat belt 75% of the times. Thus, there is a lot of need for creating awareness about proper seat belt use in India. And this was why we thought we raised this very important aspect in this webinar today. Belt your life, buckle your seat belt every time. And we are fortunate today to have a very established faculty and panelists for the webinar. We have Professor Geetam Tiwari, who is Professor and Head Transport Research and Injury Prevention Center at IIT Delhi. She is the Trip Chair, Professor and Head Transportation Research and Injury Prevention Center and Joint Faculty at the Department of Civil Engineering at Indian Institute of Technology here in New Delhi. Her research focus and teaching includes transportation planning, transport economics, transport and highway safety, and non-motorized transportation planning and safety to undergraduates and graduate students. Then we have Professor Sudipto Mukherjee, who is the Henry Ford Chair Professor, Department of Mechanical Engineering at IIT Delhi. He is a BTech from IIT Kanpur and PhD from Ohio State University, USA. He is trained in kinematics and robotics. He is a member of the International Research Council for the Biomechanics of Impact. He also specializes in using finite element simulations to study injury from car and motorcycle crashes using human body models and adapting principles of safety and biomechanics in the Indian context. Then we have Miss Emma Harrington, who is joining us today from Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. She is the Director of Injury Prevention and Education Services. Shepherd Center in Atlanta. She has spent 10 years in hospital-based injury prevention, developing programs and interventions aimed at stemming brain and spinal cord injuries. She's an instructor for the American Trauma Society's injury prevention curriculum. She holds a Master's of Education degree in International Education Policy from Harvard University. Originally from Boston, Emma is a licensed social studies teacher. We also have Shivani Gupta. She is a technical advisor inclusion in the Christian Blind Mission. She's a highly motivated person with disabilities who is extremely passionate about disability, inclusive developments and rights. Shivani also had a road traffic accident way back in 1992 and is a tetraplegic. But she holds a PhD from the University of Maastricht, Netherlands, and her PhD was titled Invisible Lives, Tales of Persons with Disabilities in Rural India. Over 25 years of experience in working towards promoting inclusive community living in India and globally. Her areas of expertise include inclusion and accessibility, disability inclusive disaster risk reduction, assistive technologies, and support services. Then we have Mr. Dipak K Dash, Senior Editor, The Times of India. Sorry, Senior Assistant Editor, The Times of India. He's a journalist with more than 15 years work experience in newspaper and magazines, skilled in journalism, public storytelling, political copywriting, strong communication professional, and graduated from Utkal University. He's a fellow of WHO in road safety reporting and John Hopkins Bloomberg Fellow on road safety. He believes in writing that makes difference, and not only for good reading, because people who want to improve their literary skill can read novels and fictions. A journalist must break news that any ruling dispensation tries to hide and do good follow-ups. So with this esteemed panel, we move ahead with the panel discussion today in this very important webinar. I would start with the first question. Is there sufficient evidence that seatbelt use in vehicles is useful in reducing deaths and injuries due to road traffic crashes? Could you please elaborate? And I would want to start by requesting Professor Geetam Tiwari to address this important question. Professor Geetam Tiwari, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chhabra, for organizing this very important panel discussion. And yes, I think the answer to your first question is, now there is overwhelming evidence because large number of studies have been done in not in India, but in all other countries where seatbelts has become mandatory. And the evidence shows that for front seat passengers, the reduction in fatalities for people wearing seatbelt compared to people not wearing seatbelt is 40%. The range is between 40 to 60% for front seat passengers. And it is equally important for people who are sitting in the rear seat also. Seat belts are very effective and very useful for rear seat passengers also. And there also these studies show that the benefit is actually 60%. So 60% people do not get fatal injuries if they were wearing a seatbelt as compared to people not wearing a seatbelt. So I think now there is overwhelming evidence they are effective, both for front and rear seat passengers.
Thank you, ma'am, for this very important statistics, which clearly shows that seatbelt use can prevent a lot of injuries and deaths in road traffic crashes. May I request Professor Sudipto Mukherjee also to throw some more light on this question?
Good evening. So you already had a perspective of the data. So the other way of looking at it is that, so since we've been working on seat belts for now nearly 50 years, the science of it has pretty much been also worked out. And so essentially when our car crashes, so you're going at say 36 kilometers per hour, which is nearly our average speed in Delhi, and in free traffic, if you crash, you're going to have about a 15th of a second before the car comes to a stop. And it creates what is called effectively 15 times the gravitational force on your body. And that is something that we just can't absorb in our body. So you can pretty much show that if you use seat belts, then there is some play. And so you can do these kind of simulations, many and many of them. It's been done repeatedly using different technologies, and it shows that you can get the your deceleration down to something like 5 Gs, which the human body can tolerate, and it saves. And many more combinations have been looked at for seat belts, where to place the child, where not to place the child, and these verifications have been done using extensively what we call test dummies. So yes, now it's overwhelming that it is, you have to wear seat belts to save lives, and it saves about 50% of fatal injuries, just the seat belt, and about 70% of other minor injuries. And then if you put in an airbag, then you get much more, but that's a separate story.
Thank you, Professor Sudipta Mukherjee. May I request Emma also to throw more light on this question?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. We see that seatbelts are the #1 way to protect yourself and your loved ones within your vehicle. Since 1975 in the United States, seatbelts are estimated to have saved over 374,000 lives. And in 2017 alone, 14,955 lives were saved by seatbelt use. We know that our seatbelt compliance rate is very high in the United States. It's at 90.4%. There are questions about whether that is completely accurate. And certainly since the pandemic, we have seen a massive increase in fatalities and injuries in vehicle crashes, despite our vehicle miles traveled being much, much less due to lockdowns and staying home and working from home. But generally, yes, the statistics quoted, we have the same ones from NHTSA, which is our National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. If you buckle up in the front seat of a passenger car, you reduce your risk by 45% of a fatal injury, moderate to critical injury by 50%. And in light trucks, if you buckle up, that is even greater. Your risk of a fatal injury is reduced by 60%, moderate to critical injury by 65%. So we know that seatbelts are critical in saving lives and saving limbs. And we know that they work in conjunction with the airbags. In the States, often you'll hear, if I buckle up, why buckle up if I have an airbag? They're designed to work in conjunction together, and they can counteract each other when not worn properly. The other thing we see is seatbelts have to be worn properly to get those great effects of reducing risk of injury and death. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. I think we have enough evidence that has been pointed out from our esteemed faculty from IIT and also from our colleague from Shepherd Center in Atlanta. They have clearly brought about the use of seatbelt, how it is productive in reducing injuries and deaths in road traffic crashes. There was this meta-analysis of 11 studies from 2005 to 2018. Overall, the risk of any major injury was significantly lower in belted passengers compared to unbelted passengers. So belt use significantly reduced the risk of any injury as brought out in this meta-analysis. This study from Nigeria also pointed out that statistically significant mortality rate of 79% of patients who had road traffic crash and were not using seat belt. This study also concluded that seat belt is a useful safety device that not only saves lives, but also dramatically minimizes the degree of injuries that a car occupant may receive if they were not wearing it. And these statistics from the government of India clearly point out that there are a significant number of persons killed due to non-use of seat belt every year. And even if we were able to save these 15 to 16% of lives just by a seatbelt use, that would mean a lot to these people, to their families, and to all of us. So moving forward, we will discuss also on whether front-facing rear seatbelt use is important or not. Is there sufficient evidence in this regard? May I first ask Professor Sudipta Mukherjee to respond to this question.
To start with, if you are in the rear seat, you are not that affected by the crash. So if you just look at numbers, again, these numbers are consistent from the US and Europe. You look at it in quite detail. Since you have less fatalities and you're not crashing into the hard dash, but into the rear of a seat, which is actually designed to make it softer. So the saving actually is just by wearing a seatbelt in the rear is about 25% on fatalities. So that is the rough number that we are looking at. So there is evidence for that. And again, coming from the physics perspective, you can work out these numbers. So if you're wearing a seatbelt and the crash speed is actually less than about 20 kilometers per hour, which by the way is the average crash speed in Berlin, which is has a stream speed which is much higher. So you would then have a reduction of nearly 90% in the fatalities in the rear. So literally you would have none if you're wearing the rear seat belt. So there's a different issue with a front-facing, rear-facing for child seats, which is a different issue, and rear-facing child seats are more effective than front-facing child seats till about 10 years of age. So that's a secondary thing, and again, that is backed up by real good physics and science. So yes, it's very important. And so the danger is not only to the rear occupants, but also to the fact that you can be ejected out of car very easily when you're on the rear. There's a lot of space for you to be projected, and there are also cases where you've been projected out of the dash. And if you get ejected from a car, then the probability of a fatal injury increases tremendously.
Thank you, Professor Sudipta Mukherjee. May I request Professor Geetam Tiwari to give her views on whether rear seat belt use is also important?
Yeah, so I think the science of it, Professor Mukherjee has explained, but I have come across recent studies in last 3 years, which in fact are showing that the risk to rear seat passenger has increased. And that's because the front seat has become very safe because we also have airbags there. But for the rear seat passenger, if the seatbelt is not worn, what exactly Professor Mukherjee explained that the passenger can go and hit the front windshield, and that becomes a very serious injury. So now it has become very, very important for rear seat passengers also to wear a seatbelt, because front seat has already become much safer with a combination of seatbelt and airbags. So therefore, the rear seat passenger, it's the seatbelt which is going to reduce major injury. So it's very important.
Thank you, Professor Geetam Tiwari. Emma, you just heard from our professors of the Indian Institute of Technology. You know, we are talking from a country where many of the vehicles do not have seatbelt provision, right, in the rear seats per se. What is your view? What is the US experience in this regard with rear seatbelt use?
Currently, we are having an issue with what they deem short trips or the rideshare industry. So Ubers, Lyfts, taxi drivers. So when you get in those what you deem short trips, people are not buckling up in the back seat. So that is something that we are combating at the moment, trying to get mass media campaigns out there about the importance of buckling up in the rear, just as the two doctors previously mentioned with the statistics. And in 2018, NISTA states that there were 803 unbelted rear seat passenger vehicle fatalities. And they estimate that if everyone had been buckled up, half of those lives would have been saved. So it's very important. And one thing that we do, especially with teenagers and younger drivers, is talk about how you're protecting everyone in the car when you belt, because you can become a human torpedo or a human missile and injure the other passengers within the car. So it's an act of love to buckle and make sure everyone is buckled. In the States, we have what are called graduated driver's licensing laws. Generally, they're the same over the 50 states, but these are designed, they're laws and regulations designed to keep teenagers safe. So when you first start driving, you're not allowed to have other teenagers in the car. You're only allowed to drive your family members. And there are various stages to do this. And that is to combat what we see as really risky behaviors, multiple teenagers, distractions, speeding, that you gain more confidence as you have more experience and hopefully reduce those risky behaviors. But yes, backseat belting is super important. And we definitely try to push that with these graduated driver's licensing laws, as well as mass media campaigns that we do.
Thank you, Emma, for letting us know about the US experience in this regard. According to WHO Seat Module 4, the manufacturer of every motor vehicle of M1 category should provide seat belt for a front-facing rear seat occupant, as wearing seat belt can decrease the risk of being killed by 25% and injuries by 75%. In fact, Professor Geetam Tiwari talked about people traveling in the rear seat striking the windshield with devastating consequences. And this study talks about unbelted rear passengers raising the risk of fatality for belted front seat occupants by roughly 5 times in crashes. This was a study on rear seat belt usage and child road safety in India, based on a national survey conducted by Save Life Foundation, by Marketing and Development Research Associates and Nissan. And 70.5% respondents affirmed to the presence of rear seat belts in their car. Only 7% said that they use it regularly. So even if there was a provision, only 7% used it regularly. And mind you, the central rear seat seldom has a seat belt. And if it has only the lap seat belt provision in India so far. Again, they tried to observe and they found that 98.2% people did not use rear seat belts in their observational study. And also only 11.2% school bus or van drivers reported that school buses or vans have seat belts for all passengers. So these studies have brought out that even though there is enough evidence on the benefits of seat belt use, whether in the front or whether in front-facing rear seats, the compliance in this regard is quite low. Let me now come to Shivani Gupta and ask her on what is the legislation in India pertaining to seatbelt use.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak in this very important webinar. And I come to this webinar as a layperson who has, had several accidents and have really experienced firsthand what Professor Sudipto, Dr. Geetam Tiwari or Emma just spoke about. And it's really unfortunate, like from my perspective, when I think about seatbelt, the only legislation or what comes to mind is that there is a 1,000 rupee fine if the driver, co-passenger, or the rear seat passenger is not wearing a seat belt. So it's hardly, any kind of it's very easy for people to actually not wear a seatbelt because it is not so well implemented. And Emma just spoke about the Uber drivers or the cab drivers where the short trips people are not wearing seat belts. And this is something that happens to me. I am a regular Uber user. I use a taxi. Every time I sit in the taxi, I sit in the front seat because I am a tetraplegic. And the Uber driver would invariably say that, madam, you don't need to wear a seatbelt if you don't need, if you don't want, it's okay. So this driver is not really worried about any kind of fine that he may have to face. So therefore, just to sum it up, I think the legislation needs to be stronger. There needs to be much better implementation of whatever mechanisms are there for enforcing this legislation and encouraging people to wear the seat belt.
Thank you, Shivani. A very loud and clear message from Shivani, who perhaps is the panelist who has herself experienced such an injury due to non-use of seatbelt probably. And that message should go out loud and clear, not only to all the participants here, not only to the entire community of India, but also to the policy makers. What Shivani is trying to implore upon is not only have good legislation, but also enforce it so that there is enough compliance, because legislation without enforcement loses its teeth totally. May I now also request Dipak Dash ji. Dipak Dash ji, you have been writing a lot about injury prevention, and they say that the power of the pen is very strong because the pen can influence a lot of people and a large section of the community. Dipak Dash ji, can you throw some more light about the legislation in India pertaining to seatbelt use, in addition to what Shivani has already commented upon? We may have temporarily lost Dipak. No, Dipak Das ji is here. Dipak Das ji, please.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible now. Very
yes,
well.
sir. So there are some very interesting things. One of them is my voice is getting echoed.
No problems. We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. So you asked me about how this seatbelt thing came up in our country. If we go back to our CMDR rules of 1989, then for the first time we talked about seatbelts and 3-4 other items relating to the vehicles. In 1993, the standards were notified. So before that, it was almost like everyone knew that there is a need of seatbelt, but what quality of seatbelt should be there came up in only 1993, and the rear seatbelt rules, that is a mandatory thing, came in 2002. Now there is an interesting perspective when you were all talking about why seatbelts are not becoming that popular. It took long time for India. If I remember correctly, by talking to different people, Indian automobile industries initially did not support seat belts. That's the truth. That's the truth. Because they somehow thought that where is the need of a seat belt? But after a long persuasion, they finally agreed to the seatbelt thing. Then we came up with the new standards. And what Shivani ji said, what all other panelists said, I say that you have many scriptures at home, but you don't know how to read. Those are meaningless. So you have seatbelt, but people are not wearing. So how does it help? Even if you have 5, 6, 7, 8, any number of seatbelts. That can happen only when there is enforcement. And enforcement, what we all have learned in past few years, that education doesn't bring awareness. It's only enforcement brings awareness. Because the minute you have a fear that you are going to be caught and you have to pay for that, then you fall in line. I think that's missing. That's missing. What Dr. Chhabra talked about, Save Life Foundation survey, there is another survey by Maruti Suzuki, which found that only 25% people are found using seatbelt. And when it comes to rear seatbelt, only 4% persons were wearing seatbelt. So now the problem is having a legislation, having a rule for the sake of saying that we have a norm, we have notified the norm. But if it's not being practiced, it's actually meaningless. Uh, Fortunately, the government has recently come out with a draft notification that now we'll have also 3-point seat belt in the rear side. Because as all of you know, if you are not wearing a seat belt, but you have so many airbags, it is not going to help you. So that's a positive step that has happened. But the entire problem in our system is the ecosystem doesn't. We don't look at the entire issue at a whole perspective. See, look at buses. You get into any bus in India, public transport, and look at even the drivers. They have a seat belt, but that's almost like a rope hanging from top to the bottom. So how does it help? So my point of view is that the laws are there, but without implementation, laws are meaningless. Third thing is, as a journalist, as a communication professional, I feel that we have also failed in our job because what we write doesn't, bring any change, but we keep on writing the same thing again and again. So the time has come that we need to find a new way because you cannot keep on doing the same thing, which is not bringing out any result. So, if in 1989 we had seat belts, and even now, if the compliance is barely 25%, it means we have completely messed up or we have missed something. So the time has come that there has to be an approach. Maybe the health professionals, police, medical professionals, all of us need to come together and campaign for it in a very, very innovative way. Which like I can give an example. Mm, you see the same advertisement of Coca-Cola 10 times, but you watch it because it is so innovative. Every time it changes. But unfortunately, when we talk about road safety, wearing seatbelt, wearing helmet, we have very standard, information. Please wear a helmet. It's your own head. After 2 times reading, you forget. You said no, it's the same message. So as a communication professional, we also need to come out with new ideas, how to put across the views. But in that, to make a message more strong, we need to have strong evidence, and that evidence will come from doctors, experts. I think we need to work together. Then only things will change.
Thank you, Dipak Dash ji, for bringing out that even though there is legislation in India, but till we do not enforce it appropriately, it will not have the desired results. And that compliance can be ensured only by coming out with innovative techniques to raise community awareness in this regard and to motivate them in this regard. Professor Sudipto Mukherjee wants to add something to the discussion.
India has a peculiar structure in which vehicles, the whole business is in what is called the concurrent list. So we have the motor vehicle rules, but that rule is implementable at the local level only when it becomes the act in the state. So there are several states which have not converted this into rule. So it is not the law in several states. So this is something which has to be taken care of, legislatively and through the appropriate forum. It's a big point that it has to be done state by state, and enforcement has to be implemented. So there is a gap. There is a legal gap in the whole process which needs to be sorted out. And not implementing the Central Act is also a mark of protest. It's a mark of political protest also. So this is something which I think we academics have difficulty dealing with. Though somebody like Professor Tiwari goes out on the streets and meets people, I unfortunately don't. But that is a gap which has to be sorted. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sudipta Mukherjee. I think this is a very important point, and especially at a time when the Directorate General of Health Services is framing an injury prevention program for implementation. All these are very important points that can be brought to their notice so that we bring more teeth to existing legislation and ensure also compliance and enforcement. So as was pointed out way back in 1989, right, we had the central motor vehicle rules, right, wherein it is clearly mentioned that in a motor vehicle in which seat belts have been provided. So there is a loophole in which seat belts have been provided. It should be ensured that the driver and the person seated in the front seat or the persons occupying front-facing rear seat. So way back in 1989, they had the vision, as the case may be, wear the seat belts while the vehicle is in motion. Rule 125.1 requires the manufacturer of every motor vehicle other than motorcycles and three-wheelers of engine capacity not exceeding 500 cc shall equip every such vehicle with a seat belt for the driver and for the person occupying the front seat. And then again, there is a provision that manufacturers have to equip with a seat belt for a person occupying the front-facing rear seat. So there has been a legislation from way back in 1989. And now there is news that the government will soon make it mandatory for automakers to provide only 3-point or Y seat belts in all the seats of a car, including for the third passenger seated in the middle of the rear seat. As I was talking about previously, generally the middle seat in the rear seat of the car generally only has a lap seat belt, or they do not have a seat belt. Now the government is soon going to make it mandatory for automakers to provide for this. And if it is provided for, there is already legislation that people need to comply to it. I will now come to the next question. Do we need to modify seat belts for special cases? Example, pregnant women, obese individuals, etc. If yes, could you elaborate how? Let's now start with Emma, and please throw more light on this question. Are there special requirements for seat belts?
I would like to take this opportunity to talk about a program that we have here at home called CarFit. And it's where occupational therapists or certified driving specialists have people come through so we can look at how they fit in their car. It was a program designed for older adults, but it works for everybody. And it's a chance to educate people on how this portion of their belt can be lifted or lowered for a better ergonomic fit. So rather than misspeaking about where a seatbelt should go on a woman that is pregnant, I thought I would leave that to the other two speakers. But to really highlight this program, it's a wonderful program for free. Unfortunately, it hasn't been done since COVID, but we hope to get back to that program where you can see that, yes, it's exceptionally important that everyone wear a seatbelt, regardless of pregnancy, of height, and how that works. I will leave to the other two presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Professor Geetam Tiwari, would you want to also respond?
No, I think I would pass this question to Sudipto. He is most competent to answer this because he can explain the physics of it.
Sure, sure. Professor Sudipto.
Okay, so, well, so but let's go back and say, what is a car designed for? So the car and all the safety features are designed for what is called the 50th percentile American male, who is about 5'10" and I think weighs 78 kilograms. And to start with, that is no longer the average, the median American male weight anymore. Americans have become heavier. And so when you take this car, which is designed for, that American male, and you are, 50 kgs, or you're 60 kilograms, you're 5'6". Even if you're not pregnant, it doesn't work for you. So there is this, that's the first thing. And second thing is, so where is it designed? So the rules say that, currently the testing procedures say that you can adjust the seat. So you place it midway between the adjustment. But that's not how we drive the car. We drive the car, we usually have our handles on the steering wheel. Or we are sitting, so that our feet are pressed against the front wheel. So all of these are different from each person. So over the last decade or so, we have become capable of actually taking a CT scan or a MRI of an individual and create a model, and we can predict which is the best scheme for you. How far should you sit? And if you're sitting, so even the seat belt is not just a rope. It's an elastic rope. Question is, and then it has something called a limiting force. So after which it starts, giving way. So question is, can those be adjusted? So we have done some work here. There is more work which has been done in Sweden. There's a colleague who used to come to IIT very often earlier, before COVID. So they have worked on it, trying to personalize this stuff. So it is possible that a couple of years from now, we will be able to actually sense your weight and your BMI and whatever, and then tailor the seat belt to meet your specifications. So yes, that is there. But even with the modern belt or the current belt, you can take care of a few things. Like the shoulder positioning, if you're pregnant, well, it has to come over the hip. So you can actually take it below. And as long as it passes over the hip, you are safe. So there are several things like this which can be implemented, but the real thing will come if we do manage to what is called do personalization, and then let the seatbelt adapt to you. So that's it, unless you have questions.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Sudipto Mukherjee. Emma also pointed out that the seat belt should be properly worn. So the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration recommends that shoulder belt should be away from your neck, but not off your shoulder, across your chest, and lap belt secured below your belly so that it fits comfortably across the hips and the pelvic bone. Pregnant women may experience physical and psychological discomfort as a result of wearing a safety belt that may cause harm to the babies. So the lack of an appropriate fit of the current seat belt to pregnant women can be improved by having a design that takes into account the body size and shape of pregnant women. And proper use of protective mechanisms leads to a reduction of crash impact on fetus during car accidents. That were the findings of these studies, which Professor Sudipto has also very well brought out. And the odds of seatbelt use for normal weight individuals were found to be 67% higher than the odds of seatbelt use in the morbidly obese. Those were the findings of this study. Seatbelt use is significantly less likely in individuals in obese individuals compared with their normal weight counterparts. So you need to have adaptations in seat belts for pregnant and obese individuals. So there could be an extender which could be used, but it is recommended that the extender is obtained directly from the vehicle manufacturer and not from other agencies. So that is the clear message that has come across. Professor Sudipto Mukherjee brought about that the seat belts in a vehicle are designed for an average adult. There are special requirements for children, and we thought there is enough to discuss about this, and we would have a separate webinar on what would be the special restraints in children. We at the International Spinal Cord Society were trying to come across with a prevention video, and we had a discussion across the globe from experts from various countries, and that clearly brought about that in different countries there are different rules on when a child should start wearing a seat belt which is designed for adults. Though in most of these countries they have some special regulations for children. So in some places it was the height, in some places it was the weight, in some places it was the age, and some places a combination of height and age which they took upon. So there is enough to discuss in this regard, but like one suit is not designed for everyone. Everyone has to have his or her own size of the clothes that they wear. Similarly, the seat belt needs to be individualized also for use. We have a question from Khamiraji. You may put across your question. We will have we'll break in between. Yeah, please go ahead. Are you able to unmute yourself? Or please write down your question in the chat box, and we'll get back to you soon in this regard. So, if you are not able to unmute, still we will request you to just write down your question in the chat box, and we will come, but we will unmute all participants also and let them also put across the questions directly to the panelists at the end of the panel discussion also in this regard, right? So moving forward. So we will just come to the next question meanwhile. As per reports, compliance of seatbelt use in India is very low. India scores 3 out of 10 in enforcement of seatbelt law as per WHO report. So this very important question to our panelists from India. How can compliance and enforcement be improved? Can we do that scientifically using knowledge about determinants of the behavior of seatbelt use? What is more important, awareness or enforcement to ensure more use of seatbelts by people during driving? So let us start first with Dipak Dash ji. Dipak Dash ji?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. So what you're talking about, this WHO report, that say that out of 10, only 3 is the score. So far as the enforcement of seatbelt is concerned. I think most of the panelists must be aware that WHO came out with this global status report, in which they took the views from the government departments itself. So there is nothing hiding when they are saying that compliance is hardly 3%. That's quite correct, because even all other studies also show the similar trend, whether it's by Save Life Foundation or by Maruti Suzuki. So now the question comes, how do we, as you say, how do we increase the compliance? See, the compliance is increasing in cities like Delhi, Mumbai, primarily because there is good enforcement. And there have been very recently, there have been very interesting findings, or rather some revelations by NIC, the National Informatics Center. Because now in Delhi, at a lot of places, this high quality, high resolution cameras have been put, and the cameras are now detecting whether people are wearing seatbelt or not. In a couple of cases, they have been found that some lady were not wearing seatbelt. Uh, they were putting a kind of sari, the cloth that looks like a seatbelt, but the camera could detect it. So I think one of the way to make people follow the rules until we get much more aware of this is that we increase enforcement in a manner that every time you do a mistake, you are corrected. Why I'm saying, if we look at the success of Swachh Bharat scheme, one of the flagship programs of India against open defecation, even that's also a scheme for change in behavior of people. But that happened when there was enforcement. There was no fine, but at the same time, the society worked as an enforcement agency. If you remember, in every village there were small groups of small children, women, men. They were called as Nigrani Samiti. They will go to the village if someone is going for open defecation. They will put a light on him so that he will feel bad that see I'm going to be caught. So the point is, the enforcement has to happen whether as a form of penalty or making people feel bad that they are not doing it right. I think Australia has some interesting examples where the negative campaign was done to against speeding. Beautiful girls will stand on the street or on the roadside, and they will indicate if a person is driving at a high speed, to tell that, see, this is not a style. This is actually a bad thing. So it has to be a mix of everything. Police has to do more enforcement. Enforcement means, as I said, every time you do a mistake, you should be caught. It should not be like you do the mistake 100 times, get caught only one. Second thing, uh, this awareness will come when our messaging becomes much more better. Like I have been requesting this our trauma professors or trauma professionals from AIMS and other agencies. I said, no, you have so much of data of how many people died for not wearing seatbelt, what kind of injury people get, but those end up only as a research paper, where I think they are more interested to put it before the international organizations rather than making people more aware about it. So there has to be a system in place or a collaboration that that tell us what are the consequences, so that we write it in that manner. Government you know disseminates that information in that manner that people come to know, oh, this is the biggest implications if people are not wearing seatbelt. I think these are the three things, and I think there is also a bigger need that we make our children much more aware. I have a 7-year-old daughter. If I throw something out, my daughter shouts at me, so that Papa, it's becoming dirty. You should not do it. I think the child is the father of man. If the child will stop the father 3 times, why you are not wearing a seatbelt? Why you are not putting a seatbelt on me? So that type of education has to happen in schools, maybe not as a curriculum, but that should be taken up as a extra curricular activity when schools can hold some kind of a small conference or interaction with medical professionals like you or professor like Geetam Tiwari ji or Mukherjee ji. I think it has to be a mix of everything: enforcement, awareness, uh, evidence-based discussion. Then it will happen.
Thank you, Dipak Dash ji. Shivani, would you want to throw more light on how can we improve enforcement and compliance?
Yeah. So I agree with Deepak ji when he talks that awareness and enforcement need to really go hand in hand, and definitely there is a need for larger awareness, because right now people wear seat belts just from the scare of being fined. They do not appreciate the seat belt as being an important aspect for their own safety and for the safety of their loved ones. So that realization really needs to come into people in general. And then one point that Sudipto mentioned was the adoption of this legislation in the state laws, the need to wear the seat belt. So again, the need to strengthen legislation all across India and not just in big cities, where, okay, a Bangalore, a Delhi and a Bombay, there are good enforcement mechanisms. So there are more people wearing, but what happens about the other cities? Because that's where the majority lives. And there is one point that I've been wanting to talk also about is um, we like we would always go for a cheaper car, because that fits into our budget, but not necessarily meets the safety norms. We already talked about the seat belts and the airbag being a combination, to get the best outcome or safety. But I mean, most of our cars that we buy, like the middle class Indians, don't have a airbag, and it is not really even mandatory. And Dipak ji mentioned that there was when there was the law of the seat belt, the biggest lobby against the seat belt in the coming into law was the vehicle manufacturers. So I think there needs to be some amount of efforts made to ensure some level of minimum um, safety standards, or whatever they're called, in a vehicle, irrespective of the cost. So I think, again, the awareness that, yeah, seat belts are important, but also equally important is that you decide on the right car or the vehicle that you want to drive to actually get that level of safety. So, I mean, that was one point that was really in my mind, and I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Shivani. I hope your message filters down to as many people as possible, because Emma will also bear me out that there are various studies that show that you may try to preach howsoever to as many people as possible, but the community will listen to more who have been through it. The same would hold true when we use peer counselors for education in the field of spinal cord injury. A doctor may try to preach anything to a person with spinal cord injury. What if you have had an injury, right? You have your mind which is functioning normally, but the individual always thinks that one who is suffering from it can understand the most. So similarly, Shivani, your experience and you're personally having gone through it, and you're trying to reach out to the community, trying to tell them that please don't look only at the costs, look at the cost benefit analysis, but look at the potentially dangerous hazards which our experts have clearly pointed out of non-seatbelt use. I hope your message reaches out far and wide to everyone in the community, so that the next time they travel in their vehicle, they do not put on a seatbelt to prevent a challan, to prevent a ticket, but do that for their own safety. I think that message should go out loud and clear to everyone. Professor Geetam Tiwari, you would have a lot more to add because of your vast experience in this field on how we can ensure, or how we can reach out to the community to try to increase compliance, and of course, how we could try to influence the policymakers to ensure that there's enforcement on this very important
Yeah, so I think enforcement is a very important issue, and that has been brought out quite well. Now, the question is, it's a difficult issue, and how do we ensure that enforcement gives us the kind of results that we are looking for? So I think two important things are required. Number one, enforcement along with messaging and campaigns. Enforcement alone will not be very effective, and messaging alone will not be effective at all. So I think the two have to go hand in hand. If our messaging is right, public messages, and then accompany that with enforcement, then it becomes much more effective. So what options do we have for enforcement? Of course, we have police enforcement, and we can see for many other things we have been successful in India also. For example, helmet wearing for the motorized two-wheeler driver has become quite good in cities like Delhi. It remains a big challenge in small cities and on highways, but because here we have police presence and the police has decided it's an important issue, they will stop people if they're not wearing helmets. They have not implemented the same kind of enforcement for pillion riders. So we can get the same learnings and implement it for seatbelt wearing also. So number one, police has to just, decide we are going to implement it, and they have to do it. And of course, the state has to notify it. And my guess is most states actually have notified at present. The implementation may not be very good, but the law has been notified in most states. Second issue is that we do have technology, and all the time, police people say they don't have enough people, they are running short of human resources. So we have this camera technology, but that alone is not going to solve the problem. So scientific study shows that if the probability of getting caught is more than 30%, that is what leads to change in behavior. So people, the road users, the car occupants who are on the road, the drivers and the passengers, if by very scientific study we can decide, where are the locations where there are targeted drives to start actually finding people and stopping them for not wearing seatbelts. If we do that in such a way that for each driver, the probability goes beyond 30% of being caught, that is what is going to lead to change in behavior. So we don't have to stop 100% of the people. We have to decide the locations, and the police has to change the location for special drives. And this is how these things have been done in other countries, not only for seatbelt, but also for alcohol, for a lot of speed enforcement. A lot of enforcement has been done with this. It should not be based on personal anecdotes or commonsensical issues. This is a scientific issue. So we need to do a lot of work in that area. That I have not seen yet in India. That's one. Second thing, it struck me that during pandemic, we did implement mask wearing, right? And that was done very effectively. People were wearing masks, and if they were not wearing masks, they were stopped all the time and fined. So if we could do that, why not extend it to seatbelts now? That means there is capability of doing it. So we should be able to do it. So I think the most important thing is the law has been notified. We have to work closely with the enforcement officers and help them do that effective enforcement with a combination of messaging and technology.
Thank you, Professor Geetam Tiwari, for bringing it out so nicely that if people could wear their mask, because if we could create awareness about the use of masks, and if we could enforce it, why can't we do that for seatbelts? Professor Sudipta Mukherjee, what do you have to add to what has already been discussed? Please unmute yourself, Professor Sudipta.
Oh, hopefully you can hear me now.
Yeah, we can hear you.
So the modern car has become so comfortable that people don't realize that they are at risk. And actually, the safest system is not to have any personal transport. The safest system is when all transport becomes public transport and is driven by professionals. So when someone like me drives a car, an amateur, because I drive it for half an hour a day, once when I'm hurrying into work and once at the end of the day when I'm tired from work, we are exposing ourselves. So the first and foremost thing is that if we have larger public transport than what we have right now, at least in India, it will take nearly 60–70% of our problems away. So that's the first thing. Now, when you are sitting in your car, it's like your living room. You have your music playing. You don't feel that you are threatened, right? And then you have this law. And so there are more recent studies which shows that quote unquote protesting face masks, not wearing face masks, not wearing seat belt are just a category of protests. And so I think there is a role of education beyond that of enforcement, where you tell people that this is not the right thing to protest. There are other things which you can protest, which are equally socially important, but will not cause so much damage to you personally and to society. So, so this change of tact, and instead of just having a system where we change things at a big level, somewhere down the line there has to be a one-on-one interaction with people saying that you better protest other things in life. This is not the right thing to protest. Take it somewhere else. I think that approach has to be adopted, and just legislation and enforcement will not take care of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sudipta Mukherjee. I think it has been amply brought out that it has to be a combination of awareness, education, and enforcement, because change in behavior can't happen overnight. It has to be a long-term process, and starting from educating children on its use, whereas enforcement can be more effective short-term. So there has to be a right combination that needs to be brought about. So there is literature, as Professor Geetam Tiwari said, we have to be scientific about it. So according to the literature, drivers dislike seatbelts because they feel uncomfortable, there is a lack of information, or they do not believe in seatbelt safety, there is forgetfulness, or seatbelt takes time to use. Most common reasons for wearing seatbelts, fortunately, are the realization that seatbelts save lives. So education and awareness become very important. Stricter penalties for non-compliance and wearing habit as per this study. So there are also determinants, which can be personal determinants and impersonal determinants which influence seatbelt use. And as Professor Geetam Tiwari also brought out, right? When using a personal vehicle, there are more chances of seatbelt use than when traveling in a van. Elderly, there is more likelihood of seatbelt use. Females have more compliance for seatbelt use. Morning times, there are more chances of seatbelt use. And as Professor Geetam Tiwari brought out, there is more compliance to seatbelt use in the cities than in the suburban areas. So this study brought out that the rate of wearing a seatbelt was observed to be low on minor roads, in afternoons, and in weekends. 95% of the respondents in this study reported supported seatbelt mandatory systems in every four-wheeler vehicle. And most of the drivers suggested that increasing awareness followed by strict enforcement should be done to increase the rate of seatbelt wearing. There are enough studies which point out that mass media initiatives, as Mr. Dipak Dash also pointed out, are very effective. There was a selfie with seatbelt campaign also, which became very popular. and using a media platform to conduct interviews can be effective. And it was also brought out that widespread coverage of traffic accidents may have contributed to a feeling of increased risk amongst decision makers, resulting in hasty and severe legislative reactions in many nations, even when they were not necessary. So, as Professor Geetam Tiwari pointed out, we have to be scientific, not only in ensuring enforcement, but also when we try to influence the policymakers to come out with legislations in this regard. So, as also this study supported, raise awareness about the consequences of non-use. Vehicles should be equipped with warning systems, strict implementation of law by enforcement agencies, and making seat belts available in public transport vehicles would be effective. So we have talked a lot about our experience in India. Let's try to learn from the US experience for seatbelt use. How can we use it for promoting seatbelt use in India? What has been the US experience? Once we hear from Emma, we will be able to rationalize on using it in India. So over to you, Emma, to respond to this very important question.
Thank you. Before I get to that question, I just wanted to address Shivani's point about how often the car manufacturers are the ones that are lobbying against these standard safety things that we as public health officials think should be standard in every vehicle. We see the same thing in the US, especially now with big trucks. Especially in my state of Georgia, the Savannah port has been widened and big trucks are coming in at an unprecedented rate. And we know that if we limited big trucks to 65 miles per hour, we could save an enormous amount of lives. But the lobbying is strong on the manufacturing side and on the big trucking side. So we do see the same parallel and push-pull between what we want as safety advocates and what is the biggest bang for your buck, as they say, for the manufacturing side. So we have not been great about masking, as I'm sure you're aware. There is a big split on masking and vaccines in the United States, and that should come as no surprise because we know in public health, in the 80s, it was the same fight over seatbelts. So in the 1980s, over 65% of Americans wanted nothing to do with seatbelt wearing, and especially did not want any legislation on seatbelts in America. And it was a big fight, and it was all about taking away our freedoms and having the government regulate us. So we see that parallel now in vaccination mandates and in masking mandates. It's the same fight. And I think we in public health have a very big public relations problem. People don't understand when they have benefited from a safety intervention, from a public health measure. They, especially when you look at food safety, people don't understand that maybe they've been saved from sickness because the CDC has pulled a bunch of salads that happen to have E. coli from the shelves before they even got to the consumer. So I think the PR issue that we have in public health is huge, and it manifests itself in all of these issues. As I stated earlier in this webinar, we have a very high rate of seatbelt use in the United States, and that's at over 90%. We at the hospital level question that number, and we know that each state is responsible for their own seatbelt compliance and for submitting those numbers to the national level. And we also know that even in Georgia, that when we hold these, they're observational studies. So there are people at the side of the road with checkboards looking into windows and seeing who is belted and who is not belted. Obviously, it's very hard to tell if a child under 5 is belted incorrectly and they're in the right car seat, but that is also in the seatbelt survey. And oftentimes the seatbelt surveys are announced on the radio. Welcome our seatbelt surveyors at this particular intersection. So I caution using us as a model for our seatbelt safety rates because it does seem a bit inflated at the state level. And that is evidenced by the people that we see even come in at Shepherd Center. Most of our young people are unbelted or unrestrained. So that is a caution. In Georgia, we are changing how we do our observational studies. So that's nice. And we're really looking forward to those results and to see how much they differ from the last year that was reported. So many of the issues that you've talked about, enforcement and really getting teeth into the legislation so that it's not 1,000 rupee fine, maybe it's more than that. We have the same issues here. And I wanted to point out what we call the safety ease enforcement. Sometimes EMS is included, having incentives, economic incentives or disincentives. It's all part of this prevention package. So when we're talking about behavioral change, all of those pieces need to be in place to push something from wearing your seatbelt to wearing seatbelts being a social norm. And how do we get people to that social norm place? And it's so difficult when you even think about washing your hands or wearing your mask. How do we make that a social norm? And I think one gentleman on here said that the use of shame sometimes works, and we do certainly see that as well. When things are a social norm, there is an element of shame in that as well. And rather than looking at us for a model, I would propose that we look at Ireland as a model. When you take in drunk driving, drink driving, they have done an exceptional job at lowering their levels, and it has been an all-encompassing mass media campaign done by advocates as well as doctors. They had very graphic advertisements pushed out, and we tend to steer away from the scared straight tactics and those kind of really scary graphic things. But when done in conjunction with enforcement and major economic disincentives, it seems to have worked for them. We do have a history in the States of the MAD program. It was the Mothers Against Drunk Driving. In the 80s, they really pushed and campaigned for better legislation, better regulation, better enforcement, and that has brought our numbers down. But the major caveat in all of this is that we have seen the biggest spike in roadway fatalities and injuries that we have seen in 96 years in 2020 and 2021. And that is due, we think, to the pandemic and risky behaviors being way, way up. For the first time ever, even in Atlanta, our roadways were clear. And so the people that were still traveling back and forth to work had a clear roadway, which in Atlanta is unheard of. We have enormous traffic. So speeding is up, unrestraints are up, drunk and drugged driving are up. So a bit of caution there. We are still struggling with all of the same issues that I hear you all talking about here. So I do believe that the takeaway is really looking at those 4 safety E's and having a strong component in each of them if we are moving from behavioral change to social norms.
You're muted, Dr. Chhabra.
Thank you, Emma. That was very useful. I think the struggle always continues because we can never achieve perfection, and we always have to strive to achieve perfection. But we can only say that the compliance rates in your country is far higher still than in India, even if we were to believe that some part of it may be inflated. Of course, we have to learn from the experience of all the countries and try to use that to our advantage, because every life that we can save would be very useful. So we can see that from various studies that compliance of seatbelt use increased over the years. And what was very interesting was, when we did this literature search, was that non-compliance was notable in counties which are secondary enforcement states. So there was higher rate of non-compliance in counties which are secondary enforcement states, and a higher prevalence of seatbelt use in counties which have primary enforcement laws. So secondary enforcement states would be where law enforcement officers may issue a ticket for non-wearing of seatbelt only when another traffic infraction has occurred. So similarly, this other study also brought about a similar finding, that in primary enforcement states, the compliance was as high as 86% as compared to 75.7% in secondary enforcement states. And of course, here also females had a more compliance than males. So the study brought out, that was the study from the United States Department of Transportation, that convenient and comfortable seatbelt, buzzer reminder system, promise rewards for buckling safety, threaten punishment for not buckling belt, make a commitment to buckle use, demonstrate safety belt usage, show a safety belt film, present slogans, demonstrations, instructions, or educational materials, and all these can increase safety belt use. So another study in Wyoming, which also brought about the factors which impacted the choice of wearing seat belt. And this study, in fact, a survey which questions about seatbelt use in different situations. And the reason to wear a seatbelt was mainly, the endorsement was want to avoid serious injury or death. Seatbelt use is a habit. Seatbelt use is the law. Don't want to get a ticket, still came low down. So we have to learn from these experiences. And weighted reasons for seatbelt non-use, right? I'm driving a short distance. So, but even in a short distance, you can have an accident. I forgot to use. Seatbelt is uncomfortable, was in a rush. So Emma also pointed out how driving short distance, we need to create awareness that seatbelt use is equally important. And she talked about the various initiatives, right? She talked about one initiative, but there are various initiatives in your country, Emma, and we need to learn from it. And we need to also come out with various such initiatives in order to increase compliance. So we have learned a lot about the importance of seatbelt use. We have tried to discuss how we can increase compliance and enforcement of seatbelt use in India. But before we wrap up, I would want to ask all the panelists one by one on what they think is the most important factor which we need to consider in India for improving compliance and enforcement of seatbelt use in India. And let's start with Shivani first, because Shivani, you are one of the very strong voices which would be heard across and will have a great impact on the community across India. So your one point, most important point that you feel.
So very quickly, there is a lot that I heard today and many things I was unaware of. So my one point would be that there needs to be further discussions with various stakeholders, you know, whether it is the government, whether it is the health professionals, you know, researchers, and people like me who are really like people who have lived through these kind of experiences, to discuss and think about and bring out strategies of actually addressing and increasing seatbelt use.
Thank you, Shivani, for pointing out that it can't be left just on the government or on enforcement agencies. All stakeholders need to be involved if we need to bring about a change. So very important point. Thanks, Shivani. Dipak Dash ji, your most important point.
My view will be, as everyone said, the best way is to create awareness and also the enforcement. I think one way of enforcement will happen only when the people in power will be motivated. Unfortunately, in our country, everything is very individual oriented. And I think if I can give you one example, recently our road transport minister gave an example that when he was traveling in a VIP car in 3 states, he found that the driver was putting the seatbelt buckle beneath him, so that it doesn't give any alarming sound. So there's a problem. Even if we have a system that if you're not wearing a seatbelt, you will get an alarming sound, but people are also trying to avoid that. So one way of making people more aware that there is a need of wearing a seatbelt, one option is to come out with demonstration of the impact of not wearing seatbelt. Like if doctors can come together with media professionals, with many social media channels which are working on this. If you can, somehow demonstrate that if you are not wearing seatbelt, this is the kind of accident you will or crash that you face, and why it will be fatal. So even if you don't die, there is a possibility that you will become like a vegetable for the rest of your life. I think until people see, there is a saying, seeing is believing. Once you see, then you become much more aware, you become much more concerned. So, barring, rather besides the enforcement, our communication or the way we make people aware, that has to be very, very forceful with evidence, and maybe either visual evidence will have much more impact. I think we need to work on that. Maybe the civil society organization, media, doctors, and the safety professionals, then professionals like our two esteemed professors. I think that we need to do a collaboration. Until that happens, I will be saying something, you will be saying something, and most of us will be saying it for the sake of getting some kind of research document published, but it will have no impact on it.
Thank you, Dipak Dash ji. And we know that you have a very strong role to play in creating awareness. The power of the pen is very mighty. So, Emma, your one point where you would want us to focus to increase compliance and enforcement.
I think my final point is the importance of parents modeling the behavior we want to see in our children. So child restraint use drops by 40% when parents ride unrestrained. And I think that all starts from the very moment we're putting them in their car seats. And one thing we do really well here is child occupant protection. And we use a program that's a worldwide program called Safe Kids Worldwide. And it is a social norm now that in America, when you have a baby, you go to your fire department because they are trained on how to properly install a car seat and tell you which one to use. And I think that importance of parents modeling from the very, very beginning that being restrained is paramount is huge in this fight.
Thank you, Emma, for bringing out this very important point. And they say, if you need to try to ensure compliance, you need to catch them young, when they are very young, and you need to be like a role model. So these are very important points that you have brought about. Next, coming to Professor Geetam Tiwari. Professor Geetam Tiwari, your very important point on where we need to focus.
So, for India, our major issues are pedestrian and motorcycle safety. And car occupant safety is gradually becoming more and more important. So for motorcycle safety and for car occupant safety, increasing compliance in case of car seatbelt use and in case of motorcycle helmet use is absolutely important. I think my one important point would be that we start this as a major campaign accompanied with major enforcement drives. But most important, document the experience. We have to do lots of evaluation studies and learn from our own experience to improve our performance and intervention in the next phase. So phase one, start these campaigns and drives along with taking down important data, how where the compliance is, we are more successful, how people are reacting, and based on that, come up with phase two strategy.
Thank you, Professor Geetam Tiwari, for bringing out two very important points. In fact, we will have a separate webinar because it is clearly established that there is a vulnerable population which is at risk on the roads. And the vulnerable population in India actually are the pedestrians, are the two-wheelers, motorized or non-motorized. And there needs to be a lot of emphasis on that. And we thought we would have a separate webinar to focus on that. And also for bringing out that unless you have the real data, Emma also said, okay, you can learn from the experience, but you need to customize it to Indian requirements. And till you do not have the data on what is it which causes the most morbidity, till you do not have the data on what influences the people the most, because Indians are Indians, You can't have the same rules. You can't just adopt rules from the other countries and try to implement them in India. So thanks for bringing this very important point across. So Professor Sudipta Mukherjee, your most important point.
Yeah, so there is this thing that Plato had said long ago, which is, he called poetry thrice removed from reality. So now this issue is, I can do simulations, we can have data, but people don't see that as reality. That is just, people don't understand math. They don't like for us to tell them that this is the reality. So, and this reality, thrice removed hits them when there is somebody near and dear who has been who's been affected by a crash. So even though we are concerned greatly about seatbelt usage, and the number of cars users is still less than 10%. I mean, it will take us at least another 14 years to get to $10,000 as the annual income per family, where every family can afford a car. So there is this economic aspect of it, and I hope that by the time that comes around, we will all be strapping up. So I don't think the social environment currently will get to it the normal way, the way it's happened in other places, because of the very low penetration of cars. And there is a linked issue which Geetam has brought out, is that because we do not appreciate the fact that we are ourselves in danger when we are sitting inside the car, we are also complicit in endangering the people who are outside the car, which is the one which she was calling the vulnerable road users. Everybody outside the car, the two are linked problems. So there has to be a push, and in India, I think the push will come from the vulnerable road users as and when they start feeling more and more threatened by the car users, and the enforcement will come from that side. It will not come spontaneously from the car users. So we have to push that side also.
Thank you, Professor Sudipta. I think there is a need to create awareness also on that. It is important to learn also from science, and not only, unfortunately, from personal experiences, because it can be painful to go through a personal experience. So there are very good institutes in the country and abroad which can have simulation studies and which can help us learn a lot. So friends, we have had a very important session today. I think the carry home message comes out loud and clear. Seatbelt use is safe. Seatbelts are for everyone. Seatbelt keeps you safe. So the next time you travel in your vehicle, remember, seatbelts save lives. Someone needs you back home. So always buckle up. Be a responsible citizen, because it's not only lives, but it also affects the economy substantially. So not only for yourselves, but for all your loved ones, buckle up for your safety rather than preventing a ticket being issued for you as you travel. And buckle up properly. So friends, will quickly want to point out to you that this webinar has been brought to you by Spine Wellness and Care Foundation, a charitable non-governmental organization established for improving the wellness of people with spinal ailments in India. We reach and serve persons affected with spine-related ailments medically and socially to help them lead better lives. Our main objective is to provide medical rehabilitation, vocational, recreational, and social support for persons affected with spine and related ailments. And you can reach us either through our website or through Facebook or YouTube or Instagram. In fact, this webinar would be available to anybody who would want to listen subsequently through YouTube. And there are many people who have joined us through Facebook as well. Similarly, this webinar has been held in collaboration with the Spinal Foundation, which was set up in 2014 as a pan-India umbrella organization to partner all individuals and organizations which have been working regionally in the spinal cord injury space, inclusively or exclusively, with the motto of reaching out to all persons across India and help them live well with SCI. TSF partners with various organizations in most of its endeavors, as presently with Spine Wellness and Care Foundation. They can be also connected through website or through email, and Komal and many others are here through on behalf of the Spinal Foundation. And I can only let you know that it is only through the Spinal Foundation that we have Hindi translation, which is coming out in chat box for all of you, for all those who may not be able to understand English well. So Madhuri Paturi and Shubham Vare, we are thankful to you for the Hindi translation along with Komal, so that a lot of people benefit from this webinar. So as Nelson Mandela said, it is in your hands to create a better world for all who live in it. Friends, come join hands to improve spine wellness and care and to alleviate the burden of spine diseases. And let's work towards injury prevention in general. It need not only be a spinal injury, but you could be prone to n number of injuries, and seatbelt use is very important. Let's let that message spread far and wide across the globe. So with that, we have come to the end of the panel discussion, but we would invite any questions which may be there. I know we are running out of time, but it is very important to also address to any questions which may be there on behalf of our participants. One of the participants has very wonderfully brought out, in fact, it's a question, but I think what our friend Ravinderji has tried to bring out is that seatbelt use is as important as it is to eat every day, because unless you are safe, right, you can't have a healthy life. So let's stick to all injury prevention norms that are there. That is what Ravinderji has tried to bring out. If there are any other queries from any other participants, we'll quickly address them over the next 5 minutes. Meanwhile, Komalji, would you want to share your comments, or would you want to bring this bring out the importance? And next we'll have Dr. Pramod.
I
Yeah.
just want to point out there was a question. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible, Komal.
Hello?
Yeah, Komal, we can hear you.
Okay. There was a question from Pramod, if I'm not mistaken, in the chat. Yeah, Pramod said whether the ignition key can be connected to the seat belts. So you cannot switch on a car if you don't have, you haven't fastened your seat belts. Is that Sudipto may be able to tell us more on this? Is it possible?
Yes, it's easily possible, but there is a famous litigation event in the US where there was a car which wouldn't start, and it led to a person freezing to death because the person had too much alcohol in his breath. So there was this auto alcohol kind of tester. So disabling a car because you're not wearing a seat belt, would be challenged at least in the Indian court against right to life. Saying that if you want to, suppose you have somebody chasing you, you want to get in the car and run away, you might be in trouble. And so there are issues. Yeah, it's technically very, very feasible. And theoretically, even if your seat belt is not working, signal sensor is not working, the car will become stationary. Right. So, but then you need a trip. You don't want the car to stop because somebody has opened a seat belt while the car is driving. So difficult technical issues, theoretically possible. Socially, like I said, why do you need a car? I mean, that question is also not answered very nicely socially. It's a sense of autonomy which people derive from having a car. Otherwise, you would go in a bus. It's linked to that. It's technically possible, yes, easily. You could do that very easily. To answer your question, whether you would be able to do it legally, that's a different question.
Thank you, Professor Sudipta, for bringing out the social aspects here. It would, on a similar analogy, right? You can easily, and it is by law, you can use an app to know that a speed camera is ahead of you so that you can lower down your speed as you are approaching. So I was very surprised when I was traveling in US way back in 1994, when my friend said, okay, he slowed down suddenly. I said, why? He said, I saw on my app that the speed camera is coming up. He said, I asked him, but can you legally use it? He says, it's all right. We are in a democracy. So you also brought that out, right? So to own your life also, nobody can enforce it on you, right? So that is, unfortunately, sometimes non-democratic norms work better, but everybody needs to be aware and function like responsible citizens. Dr. Kohli, you had a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, it was a very interesting discussion. My main point has been addressed already, raised by Dr. Komal. May I suggest if disabling the car may not be feasible, say socially or legally, can there be a disturbing hooter if the seat belt is not put in, to compel the driver to instruct the persons to fasten the seat belt, something like that? Because we're all worried about the compliance.
But that's already there. I mean, the car is beeping.
Yeah, there's a light beep, but can we have a disturbing kind of a hooter? Which compels you to comply.
You're muted, Professor Sudipta, but probably you
Yeah,
are.
yeah, it's like technically possible. So at least, so one of my car is Altis, and what it does is it starts gentle. If you ignore it for some time, it gets louder, and then if you are not wearing it for extended duration, it gets really, really obnoxious with its hooting. So it does take you where you want to be through stages. Then there is again very, very possible.
No, what I'm saying, sir, this has been like mandated. This is already a standard. So every new car which is coming has to have this, particular provision. But the example that I gave you, the minister himself talks that when he was sitting in a car, he found that the buckle was already put, and he was asked to sit on it, so that there is no alarm. So I think the problem is, if someone is sleeping knowingly, what can you do, even if you have everything in place?
Thank you, ma'am. Are there any other questions from the participants? I think if there are none, it is, we've already taken a lot of your time. I would only want to thank all the eminent panelists who have joined us today, whether from different parts of India or from Atlanta in USA. I think we have a lot to learn from the experience, and we have to bring respite to people who otherwise get these devastating injuries. And we know that road traffic crashes and resultant injuries in general are going to be one of the major causes of morbidity and mortality across the globe. And that is clearly brought about by data and clearly focused upon by WHO also. And the good part of it is that the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare is developing an injury prevention program, and we should soon have better and more effective ways to prevent injuries and to bring respite to this misery. So we thank all the eminent panelists. We thank all the participants, whether they have joined us through Zoom or Facebook. And also, I would want to thank once again the Spine Foundation, and with the help of them, as we have had Hindi translation as well for the benefit of people who would not be able to understand English. So thanking all, one and everybody, Shivani, all stakeholders involved in this webinar. We'd want to thank them, like we would implore upon all stakeholders to join hands together and ensure that we have a better world with less suffering and more prevention of injuries. Thank you. Have a nice weekend. Good night.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.